is up, fellas, and welcome to a very special episode of Rewriting History with the Goob. Today, I am joined by Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, who until very recently was a professor at the San Jose, California University, teaching anthropology. She'll be talking about her experience and story. It's pretty crazy, everything that she's gone through for telling the truth. And then we'll be getting into NAGPRA and the extreme culture of archaeology. And I couldn't have a more perfect person to have on to talk about that, as she has literally written a book about it, not once, but twice, with her first book, Repatriation, an Erasure of the Past, and her more recent book, On the Warpath, My Fight Against Pretendians, the Woke Warriors, and sorry, I butchered that second title a little bit, but the link is down in the description. And one thing that I've learned about Dr. Weiss in the past month or so, learning about her, is that it is not just the title of her book. She truly is on the warpath and fighting the good fight. So please welcome Dr. Weiss to the show. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on. Let me just say, the title of the book is On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors. There are some titles of articles I've written or talks that I always get wrong. So like I wrote a book called Reading the Bones, and it's activity, biology, and culture. And sometimes I say activity, biology, and cultures, or actions. So it's not just you. I think it is the German in me that likes long titles. But On the Warpath, my battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors, which just came out in this summer.
Yeah. And I started reading one of your books. I'm not even 100% sure which one, but the introduction was absolutely fantastic. I mean, the introduction just laid out all of the problems that are plaguing archaeology, the way that wokeism has infected it and corrupted it. And I've really enjoyed it. I keep saying Weiss. It's Weiss, correct? I apologize.
That's correct. No problem.
Everything. But yeah, if you would tell us a little bit about what you've experienced, because it's absolutely crazy, some of the stuff that's happened to you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm now Professor Emeritus at San Jose State University, and I was at San Jose State for about 20 years. I started there in 2004 after a postdoc at the Canadian Museum of Civilization. And so when I got the job at San Jose State, I was like, wow, this is absolutely fantastic, a tenure-track position. And they housed one of the largest skeleton collections from a single site west of the Mississippi, the Ryan Mound. And I was to curate that collection. And so this was like a dream job, right? So, tenure track coupled with a great collection. Yeah. And I basically spent my career looking after that collection, but not only for my own research. So I used that collection year in and year out to do research on reconstructing the past people's lives, such as looking at patterns of arthritis and who was most inflicted with it, at what age, and whether that could tell us anything about their activity patterns. So for example, when you look at arthritis patterns, you notice that in modern samples and today's samples, people have a lot of lower limb arthritis, like knee pains and hip pains. That's almost unheard of in the past. But they have a lot of arthritis of the elbow and the shoulder and the wrist. And this is because they were doing things like, either hunting or grinding acorns, and so using their upper arms a lot. And so looking at these kind of patterns helps us determine, what they were doing, but also how times have changed and what aspects of disease are biological versus cultural. So in addition, like if you look over lots of different cultures, you see that arthritis is almost always related to age, so increases with age. So we know that that's part of the biological aspect of arthritis. But you also then see in different cultures, the patterns are different of which joint is affected and who gets it. And this is the culture part. And so my years looking at skeletal remains was spent trying to figure out what part of the bones is telling us how people's lives were, what part is telling us about what bone biology is, and what part is like a mix of that. And so I also looked at really unique individuals. Like, for example, there was an individual who had very severe arthritis on the jaw bone, on the temporal mandibular joint, and had his teeth very worn and a lot of arthritis of the neck at a young age. And plus, this individual was buried with more beads than any other individual in the site. And it's likely that this person was an artisan who was using their mouth to twine the ropes. And that's what caused this kind of strange pattern of pathology. And so that tells you something not only about the culture, but about this particular person, which I find fascinating. And,
yeah, a glimpse into the past. Very fascinating.
It's just, I want to tell the story of these people as accurately as possible. And I think that this is an important aspect, not to only understand the past, but to understand our own health and disease patterns. And I even wrote a book called Paleopathology in Perspective. There we go. I don't know my own title, right? Bone health and disease through time.
Right.
So I have always had this really strong love of anatomy. Even as a child, a lot of my toys were like anatomical toys, like putting together a big eye or, something like that. But also had a love of trying to understand the past and kind of this vision of what were people's past lives like. And anthropology enabled me to put those two passions together, passions that I had from when I was, like 6 years old, right? So this was a dream job,
Yeah.
and I loved it.
Made for it.
And when NAGPRA was passed in 1990. Today's the 34th year anniversary of NAGPRA, when it was enacted. And many people thought that, and maybe not everybody's watching the show knows what NAGPRA stands for. It's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And part of NAGPRA is to protect sites. But almost all of the collections housed in universities and museums in the US are actually from salvage sites. These are sites that were excavated because construction was occurring, like the modern road systems. And so basically what you have is you have sites that the other option would have been to bulldoze everything, right? So
Right.
archaeologists saved the past in that sense and helped us to tell the story about people who left no written record, because of course there was no writing in North America. and South America. You could the South American continent, you get writing a little earlier, just like in some places in the old world, writing occurs earlier than other places. But in North America, there was no written language. And so we're really telling a history that has no written language. And so NAGPRA came about, and it was a real compromise in the sense that it was supposed to be, only collections that had a clear link to a modern tribe. And it also was supposed to leave alone all artifacts that were not sacred of cultural patrimony or funerary. So other artifacts should be still available to study.
Right.
But over the years, this compromise has eroded. And in every iteration, it has eroded only in one direction, and that is to make repatriation more and more likely. When Jim Springer and I, Jim Springer is a co-author of Repatriation and Erasing the Past, and he's probably one of the smartest people I know, and I know a lot of smart people. um, he's an attorney, a retired attorney, but he also got his PhD in anthropology. So when we got together to write that book, he handled the legal aspects of why NAGPRA is not is not a law that should still be standing, so to speak, because it's really a it really violates separation of church and state. Our First Amendment, part of our First Amendment.
Yeah, you were I had never, so I care about NAGPRA. I've been talking about it on my channel a lot. I had never heard that argument until I heard it from you. And when you said that, it really clicked something in my head, because it really is such a blatant violation, but I never even would have thought to consider it. But, you know, the Mormons also claim ancient American history. If you listen to the Mormons, they were here 2,000 years ago in America. So if you were to swap out the Mormons for natives in this law, people would immediately be in an uproar, because that's such an obvious, blatant violation of church and state. To force Mormon religious leaders onto committees and to force, you know, scientists to defer to Mormon opinions for scientific decisions, that would be absolutely insane. But for some reason, through the lens of Native American religion, it's all of a sudden no longer as crazy to people. I think because we catalog Native American religion, we kind of don't really mentally classify it as a real religion. I think that's what was going on in my head. So yeah, no, it really is truly a very blatant First Amendment violation. Yeah, you're the only person I've heard point that out.
And you know, the interesting thing about it is people have said, well, you know, it's not a religious law, it's a human rights law. And I'm like, but if you speak to Native Americans, they say it's about their religion. And I'm obviously, you know, when I say use the term Native Americans, I mean, in this context, I'm talking about Native American repatriation activists, those engaged in repatriations.
Right.
Native Americans, just like any other people, have a huge, you know, variety of opinions. But I'm just talking about the people active in the movement when I'm talking about it here. But the thing is, like, it's not even just like, okay, well, you know, it's because it's their religion. It's because how the law is written. It requires the committee to have two members of who are traditional Indian religious leaders, so who are Native American and traditional Indian religious leaders. So you cannot. That's a violation in a sense, because you couldn't have a traditional. If you had just said, you know, we want to balance science, and religion, and so we're going to say we want two religious leaders, but don't say which type of religion, then you could say that's not a violation. But since the law specifically says what type of religion, that's where the violation comes in. To make it more complicated, of course, is the fact that they don't have a written record. And so, like, what is their religion? And so it leaves it up to the courts in a way to define it, which is another violation of church and state. And so what's happened with NAGPRA over the years, and I must say, you know, I was very skeptical from the very get-go of NAGPRA. I was like, you know, the first time I heard it, I'm like, this is not going to end well. Yeah. But I just did not think it was going to end well. And what happened was basically the people who thought that the compromise would hold, that we would be able to retain collections, were wrong. And by 2020, when Jim and I wrote Repatriation and Erasing the Past, when that came out in 2020, over 90% of human remains that were clearly linked to a tribe had already been repatriated. And the percentage that wasn't, the last 8 or so percent, wasn't only because Native American, because museums and universities were not repatriating materials. It was also because some tribes didn't want to repatriate things before they had land or where they hadn't decided. There was also disagreements between tribes. So it was a pretty much the universities and the museums had repatriated the remains that were to be repatriated by the original NAGPRA intent, that were clearly linked to federally recognized tribes. That's what it was about. But what happened is, over the years, when they realized that if you have it to those strict the strict definitions of affiliated, and then the artifacts being sacred, funerary, or cultural patrimony, what they realized is that this leaves a whole bunch of stuff still in the museums to study.
Right.
And they didn't want that.
If you look at Google, you just said that 90% had been repatriated. Google will tell you, and I don't know the exact percentage, but they say that there's so much stuff left to be repatriated that NAGPRA has essentially failed as a law, that museums have not done their duty of repatriating these things. But that's because, like you're describing, they're now casting this much broader net of including effectively everything.
Yes, and there is even a movement called the Everything Back movement, led by repatriation activists. And so what we've seen is, for example, they're getting rid of the term culturally unidentifiable, so that everything is identifiable. And we know that this is not true. There are people who lived in the Americas thousands of years ago who are not linked to any single tribe.
Right. Populations die out.
Yeah, there's a Paleo-Indian from Alaska they did her DNA, Sunshine Girl, and they tested it against, 200 and something different tribes, and she was not found related to any tribe. And she was not found related to any of the other Paleo-Indians. Her people died out. This happens. And so yet, like with Kennewick Man, discovered in 96, I believe. And, of course, he's the most studied Paleo-Indian because the anthropologists who got together to sue to prevent his burial, 8,000 years old about. And initially, Kennewick Man didn't look like Native Americans to Jim Chatters, who was a forensic anthropologist who looked at him first. Right. And there's a lot of debate about whether he looked Native American or not, and there's disagreements about the craniometrics studies. But in the end, when they did a DNA study, what they found, and if you Google this, you'll get the wrong answer. And
this was actually a question I had for you for this exact reason, because they were forced to retract their statements, but from what I could tell, their statements were true. So please elaborate.
So basically, they come up with saying that Kennewick Man was related to the Colville Indians, one of the tribes that wanted to repatriate him. But when you look at the DNA article, the Rasmussen et al., and then you look at the independent review that was done by a government, but for the government, I should say, both of them come to the same conclusion, that Kennewick Man is most closely related to South American indigenous peoples, not to anyone in North America. And so, of course, there's going to be some genetic link between Kennewick Man and other populations, because in some way we're all related, So, but NAGPRA was not intended to bury all remains found on the Americas that were native or indigenous to the land. It's not a pan-Indian law. It's a law to repatriate specifically remains and artifacts, certain artifacts, to specific tribes. So Kennewick Man should not have been reburied. And yet Obama signed a congressional order to rebury him as soon as the DNA study came out, even though it actually showed that he was not closely related to the North American Indians and was more closely related to the South American Indians.
Right.
And I think that this is a problem that we're constantly told that each tribe is different. We're constantly told that they're all unique. They all have their own origin stories. But then when it comes to the reburial, we're told that, oh, it's Native American, it needs to be reburied. So you can't, they want it both ways.
Right.
And that was part of the failure of NAGPRA to, basically to not realize that the people that were on the pro-repatriation side would not end their movement when the affiliated remains were reburied, that they would just argue for more and more repatriations, which is what has happened. And so in the last set of quote unquote final rules, basically there was, I don't know how many, I went through every comment, but there were like 580 or 600 comments, maybe even more, I can't even remember, about what should be, about the final rules and what changes should occur. And one of the amazing things is that, so what the final rule did change. So what the final rule, and you have to understand that the NAGPRA's law hasn't changed. The regulatory advice has changed, right?
Right. The
and
Department of Interior is effectively writing law, which is not really their job to do.
Right. And this is what the Chevron case was about. The Supreme Court Chevron case was about. I've asked the NAGPRA head office if they have any comment on that. They have not yet gotten back to me, and it's been months. But basically, what you have is in these final rules that came out, like, was it December 2022 or 23? I can't even remember anymore.
They went into effect
23.
January 12th of 2024. Yes.
Yes. So they came out in December 2023, I guess. And so basically, they say, no more culturally unidentifiable, right? That's one of the things. The other thing is, they changed the definition of sacred slightly to mean not only what objects that are used in rituals or were used in traditional rituals, but also that may be used in traditional rituals if that ritual is then rebirthed or brought back. So, then the other things they did was, they basically included in human remains things like some naturally shed items such as hair. And they also have some kind of difficult to understand wording on what, we should have deference to the Native Americans narratives, but they don't want to define deference. So sometimes you'll hear that what they mean is, if there's a disagreement, you should defer to the Native Americans. Other times it's like, well, we just mean that you should respect their terms. So, who knows? And then the other aspects are that changes that have occurred is that every object, before it's displayed in a museum or curated in a museum, needs to get approval. So not just the type of object. So let's say you have 1,000 beads, right?
Oh, goodness gracious! So every individual bead.
Exactly. That's why it's and across the nation, since this has gone into place, the Native American exhibits have closed.
Yes.
They've closed. And they're like, what's taking them so long? Because they're getting approval for every bead, every arrowhead. And this is what's taking so long.
And it's also, just real quick, like, there was an 1880 federal law that dictated that every object found in an archaeological setting on federal land has to be displayed to the public. It has to be accessible at all times to the public. So the whole premise of everything you're talking about violates this previous law. on the books. Yeah, it's just a huge mess of a law.
Yeah, and then if you look at what's happened, even if you look at what the comments were, they wanted to go further. The people commenting wanted to go further. They wanted to include in the definition of human remains photographs, X-rays, data, NFTs, and they didn't even know what NFTs were.
But those things effectively have been included, it would seem. So, like your article in Minding the Campus, right? The natives want their shit back, which is both a funny article and a pretty frustrating article to read. All of those examples were before this update went into place, correct? They were all before January.
No, not all of them. Some of them were, some of them weren't. Right. Okay. So it's a mix. But yeah, and the thing is that why are we being able to why are museums and universities losing materials that should have never been included in NAGPRA is that the curators and the professors are just basically saying, well, if they ask for it back, we'll give it back. I've asked whether I can be provided with any examples where a university or museum has said, no, this is not NAGPRA related. I have not heard back yet. And you
get the exact opposite again. Just going back to like what Google will tell you. Google will tell you that the museums are refusing to return anything. Essentially, is the narrative that they're trying to put forward. And you're saying the reality couldn't be any further from the truth.
It couldn't be any further from the truth. So when I wrote Repatriation and Erasing the Past with Jim Springer, the final rules hadn't been out yet. We wrote it in like 2017 or 2018. You know, it takes a while for it to be written and then come out. And so it came out in 2020, the end of 2020. And I think we put in the proposal in 2017 and then wrote it in 2018, 19 and got it out. And we kind of thought, you know, it's not going to make a big splash. But what we did was we took a look at we coined the term repatriation ideology to go beyond just NAGPRA, to say that there's this ideology that anything that the Native American narrative is, any Native American narrative is given more weight than science, and that this is a sliver of the postmodern ideology where there's really no such thing as truth, but really is just the oppressors and the oppressed, and you want to listen to those people who are oppressed, or the victims and the victimizers. And therefore, NAGPRA was passed with a confusion of, well, we have these kind of very clear guidelines that make a compromise. Everybody should be happy. But really, what they didn't realize that some of the people who had signed up, who were on the side of science, maybe didn't realize that this was never about this compromise, but it was always about this victim narrative versus the victimizer narrative, and there was no intent for truth because this is a postmodern ideology. And when you do that, what you get is a law, the enactment of this law following the lines of, well, if there's a scientist who says one thing and a Native American who says another, then it is always a Native American who should be listened to. And now we have that basically written into the regulations with the term deference, and also the addition of Native American traditional knowledge as a new part of the NAGPRA regulations, which ironically, if you look at the US government's definition of Native Americans' traditional knowledge, it does not need to be passed on, and it can be new. So if
it's fully moldable.
It's not traditional.
You're right. Yeah, that's also completely not traditional
about it.
Yeah.
So let's say you're a museum, you have an artifact, you talk to an elder, and he said, oh, no, that's fine. You can display it. It's not sacred. It's perfectly fine to display. and you display it. And that elder,
Forever.
that chief then steps down, and a new elder or chief steps into the position and says, "Oh, did you know that that artifact you're displaying is actually sacred?" You say, "Well, the previous chief or elder told me it wasn't." You cannot use past evidence to support continuous display, so that they can change their mind
1984.
always. And it's written as continuous consultation. So, and basically, you're never going to be finished with NAGPRA.
And the financial burden is always on the institution as well to fund all of that consultation.
On the institution and on the American people,
Right.
the taxpayers, right?
Right.
So that's the other thing. Yes, absolutely.
And you, sorry to interrupt, but you're talking about this balance a couple minutes ago. The initial intent of the law was this balance, and you read through all of the comments. I read through several of the comments on the Department of Interior page, and one of them was shocking to me because whoever's responding to the comments, I don't know if it's the secretary herself or whoever it is, very openly says that the intent of this law is not to find a balance. It is absolutely not to strike a balance between science and repatriation, that the intent of this law is exclusively to repatriate the remains and to pay deference to the Native Americans, that science is not even a factor in this. So there initially was this balance that's been fully erased by the current Department of Interior Secretary.
Yes, and it was intended as a balance, because I even have lines in there that when research is of national importance, which is kind of a difficult thing to prove, what is of national importance and what is not, but that the remains should that repatriation should be held off until the research is finished. So in a sense, that shows you that there was some science balance intended there, as well as there, evidence for repatriation or for not repatriating was to basically be both scientific, historic, and a Native American narratives. So in a sense, that was the other aspect that shows that there was supposed to be a balance. But the balance has completely fallen, and it hasn't only fallen in the sense of fallen for science. It's fallen for other things too. For example, in the last article that you were talking about, Unminding the Campus, Native Americans want their shit back. The reason why I called it that is because they are asking for things like coprolites, which can
literally,
it's literally fossilized feces that can be used to reconstruct, diet and health and so forth. But they're also asking for fine arts. And if a Native American created something to sell or for display for an art museum, those are things going to be on the chopping block. Modern art, literally, like things that made by individual artists who just happen to be Native American, who, and how they're doing this is they're misusing and abusing the term sacred and cultural patrimony. And those are the two things that are being very misused. The terms are being misused. Everything becomes sacred because there's no there's no Bible to follow. And it can change every time. So sacred is whatever you want it to be. But then the other thing is that cultural patrimony is also becoming whatever you want it to be. So, like, for example, the issues about, okay, in a children's museum, there was moccasins that were given back as items of cultural patrimony, but those moccasins obviously belong to a single child at some point. So how can that be an item of cultural patrimony? If you want to think of an item of cultural patrimony for the US, for the United States of America, it would be the Statue of Liberty. It's not going to be my shoes, no matter
Right.
who, my cowboy boots made in Texas.
Yeah.
That's the absurdity of it. And when you then cannot challenge it, because supposedly the Native American knowledge is sacred, it is unchallengeable, they are expert witnesses, and they must be deferred to. What do museums and universities do? They hand back the stuff. Now, I do think that a lot of them have swallowed the Kool-Aid or drank the Kool-Aid and really believe that they're doing right by giving everything back. And therefore, I don't even know if, let's say tomorrow, I get to wave my magic wand and do away with NAGPRA. I think the damage is done, that the indoctrination has happened, and I'm not sure that museum curators and anthropology professors would say, you know what, I think I'm going to hold on to this after all.
Yeah, I share your sentiment. I've made the statement on this channel multiple times that archaeology is dead. I think it's already taken mortal damage, and people just haven't quite realized it yet. If you don't mind, I want to talk about some of the specific stuff that's happened to you, just because of how crazy it is. And the reason that it's happened is because you're talking about the things we've been talking about right now, right? You're just having an honest, open conversation about this stuff. And your colleagues attacked you pretty viciously. And you were kicked out of your research department. They literally changed the locks on the doors, and on the basis that menstruating people, not even women, but that menstruating people were unclean and couldn't handle the Native American remains. Is that?
Yeah, so basically, that is definitely one part of it. So basically, after Repatriation and Erasing the Past came out, there was a huge attempt to get the book banned or censored. They wouldn't call it that, of course, but basically about almost 900 individuals, almost all academics, signed an open letter calling for the publisher to pull the book and to not make it available in libraries. The publisher did not pull it, thankfully, and that's also I'm thankful that Jim was my co-author, because he basically,
having a lawyer on your side.
You signed a contract to publish this book and keep it up, but it wasn't only, and I wasn't on social media at this time, so I had no idea what was going on. I was like, oh, the book is out, great. And then I get this email right before Christmas from my publisher, we are in crisis mode. And they tell me, have you seen some of the things on social media? I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about, And that's when I entered into social media and went on Twitter, because I was like, I have to see what all this is about. And so they ended up not pulling the book, but my chair and my dean basically decided that they were going to try to keep resources away from me. And my chair wrote an email to, all my.
They tried to prevent you from doing your job. They tried to take your career away. Is what I got.
And then I wrote an op-ed. So I think I'm very bad with sequencing of events. And it's funny, because when I was writing my latest book on the warpath, one of the hardest things to do was get all the dates right. And I was like, wow, that happened then and not then,
Right.
So,
very sympathetic to that myself.
Yeah. So forgive me if I confuse some of the sequences. But I wrote an op-ed about NAGPRA, California's NAGPRA, and I called it NAGPRA on steroids, because it basically said that if there's a disagreement between science and Native Americans, Native American narrative takes lead. And there were other aspects of it. And so I said, this is NAGPRA on steroids. I got accepted into the Mercury News. and which is the main newspaper in the Silicon Valley. And it got like 1,000 comments on Twitter. And they were almost all like negative. They were all, and right. Nasty, like grave robber, ghoul, racist, eugenicist, all these kinds of terms. And then I put, and of course, some of this was during COVID time. And so when this was happening, it was during COVID time. And then we went back to the university after about 17 months of being away, right, because of the COVID reaction. And I had re-entered into the curation facility that held that Ryan Mound collection that I mentioned earlier. And I loved this collection. I not only did I use it to try to, to reconstruct the past and carry out my own research, but I tried to make sure that every semester students worked with me. I published articles with undergraduate students who worked with me, for example. I reached out to at conferences and I said, if you're looking for a collection to study, come to San Jose. I had people coming in every semester, people from around the world, from as far as Australia, to study this collection, because I thought it was such an important collection that it should be learned about and used to learn about humans in general, not just as a comparison collection and so forth. But
I admire you so much for that. That's one of the things that I love about you, is that should, in my opinion, be the mindset of all academics, is that they should want to share the knowledge and communicate with people. And it seems that the exact opposite attitude has been adopted. So it's been really great to find you, who still is a true academic like that. Yeah.
And so I got back into the collection, to the curation facility, and I was doing some curational duties. Basically, there was some boxes of animal remains that we were going through that had been excavated prior, but some human remains were found in those animal bone boxes. And so I was going through and I was matching them to the human remains that they belong to, and so I was doing that, and I opened one of the boxes and I see this beautiful child's skull. And I was literally so happy to be there that I wanted to share this joy. And I took a photo, and it's just a snapshot. It's what's on the cover of my book now. And right. I tweeted, I'm so happy to be back with old friends, and posted the photo. And this just caused a big storm. It was told that it was offensive. The provost wrote this long letter about how inappropriate it was. There was an issue, then everybody made an issue about, I was not using gloves, and there's debates about whether you use gloves or not, but usually you don't use gloves on collections that have been handled by multiple people over decades, because you're more likely to drop things with gloves. That's even the National Park Service's suggestion. So I'm not dealing with a forensic case,
And you had taken pictures with these remains for the school
times.
Before, right?
Yeah, sometimes they would send the university photographer to take photos. There were pictures of me with the remains in the halls still. This was not unusual. This was no way considered disrespectful ever before, right? And if you Google anthropologist holding skull, you'll see, this is quite a common photo. It's not an unusual photo. And but what the university decided to do right at that point was they literally changed the locks on the curation facility and said, I couldn't go back in. They then put out a whole new list of protocols. I had written the original protocols for the collection, and those protocols that I had written, which were in place since 2006 or so, basically were to ensure that the collection would be well maintained and available in a good condition for the next researcher. So things like, remember to put your boxes back, don't leave any bones out overnight, no eating in the room, like those kinds of things. Those were my protocols. But their new protocols were something different. They were like, I think protocol number 3 was that no menstruating personnel are allowed to handle any remains or be in the curation facility. And I was told that this was because the Native Americans believed that women, that menstruating personnel, they wouldn't dare use the word woman, because we all know men can menstruate too. They didn't dare to use that word woman. But we all know that, menstruating personnel are so powerful when they're menstruating that they cannot be, allowed to touch skeletal remains.
Yeah.
Right? And this is the absurdity. And when you look at ethnographic research, you find that the reason why menstruating women, are not allowed in certain areas is because they're considered filthy. It has nothing to do with power. It's actually a very sexist thing, and we should not be condoning it. But there were also other ridiculous things, like you cannot take any photos, including any photos of the boxes that the remains are in. And then there's the absurd, you cannot go into the facility with something that could take any recordings or photographs, which ironically, I don't have a smartphone. And at that time, I didn't even have a cell phone. So ironically, I probably would have been the only one going in without a camera.
Right.
But they basically locked me out.
So there's a couple points that I want to make there. Just the lengths that they were willing to go to try and force you out. I mean, obviously banning menstruating people is ridiculous. They're so woke that they won't even say woman, like you said, and yet they're taking this extremely sexist, completely ridiculous measure just to get back at you. And so your own colleagues, like I said, they really came after you pretty viciously, in my opinion. And I, as someone who is a more conspiratorial person, it could be easy to jump to conspiracy here. But you're saying that this all started with Twitter, right? Like all of the negativity started with Twitter, and then your colleagues, I guess, picked up on the vibe shift, if that's what you want to call it, and then they just piled on.
I think so. I think it started with social media's reaction to repatriation and erasing the past, and then built with the other tweets that I did. Everybody at the university knew my position. Everybody who knew me, I'm not saying like everybody at the university, but like my chair, my dean, my provost, my colleagues, they all knew my position beforehand. They were all okay with it. They disagreed with it, but disagreed in the normal academic sense, which I had no problem with. But right before all of this happened, I had even won the College of Social Sciences top research award, the Warburton Award, and my talk was titled something like "A Collection Should Be Forever," about how we should not rebury bones. It included photographs of skeletal remains. So all of this was literally like in August, and the troubles started in like December. So it was literally like months, end of August to beginning of December, that everything basically shifted for me. And the other thing is, then they would start picking on other things that I've said, or I've, all of a sudden, everything that I
any
do.
Any little reason, anything. Right. I mean, they're so desperate, they ban menstruating personnel. Like if they're willing to go to those lengths, they're willing to go to any lengths.
And then the other aspect was when I was trying to rebuild my research ability, I had I had said there are materials in the curation facility that have nothing to do with NAGPRA or NAGPRA, and I would like to have access to those materials. One of those things was a very poorly preserved collection from Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, of skeletal remains. It took them 10 months to finally give me access to that collection. And the reason why is because they were looking for a way to prevent me from getting access. And I know this because when I sued my university, I saw the emails that they were sending to each other saying, how can we keep her away from the Carthage collection?
Right.
So it's not like I'm not paranoid.
That was the next half of my question, was that this all seems to have started organically. There doesn't seem to be a conspiracy against you initially. It was just Twitter getting upset and people, I guess, out of self-preservation or whatever motivation it might be, jumping onto you. But then at some point, yes, I'm sure there were meetings held about you. I'm sure there were messages exchanged about you where people were plotting on how to get rid of you, and you just confirmed exactly that. So
and
it's
then
a bit of a mix, isn't it, of organic, and there is some conspiracy elements here.
And then the other thing that they did was they decided to define X-rays as sacred. X-rays are not sacred. Under any definition, they cannot be said to be sacred from NAGPRA, because since the term sacred for NAGPRA is that it has to be an item that is used in a traditional Indian religious rite, since Native Americans never had X-rays, how could they have used it in any traditional religious activity?
Well, obviously it's because tradition is whatever they decide tradition is today. Yeah,
exactly. But that's the thing. And so go ahead.
I just, about the X-rays, because I've listened to other interviews from you, and you've used the words "burned the X-rays."
Right.
Were they literally burnt? Were they literally set on fire?
They I don't know if they have been literally burned or if they are going to be burned. They have the dean and the NAGPRA coordinator and tribal liaison all have used that term, that they plan a ceremonial burning of the X-rays. But it's not like there's telling me like, oh, by the way, this last weekend we burned the X-rays. So they may have been burned already, but they may still be.
But it's something that either has happened or will happen.
Right. That is the plan for the X-rays. Wow. And so basically, what happened was I ended up suing my university for retaliating against me for my speech and my writing. But the problem was that although I had won some of the battles in the lawsuit, others were going to be unattainable. So the judge had decided that the Native Americans were an indispensable party for the suit, but that they were sovereign, so you cannot sue them. So this leads to a catch-22. Basically, you need to list them as in your list of defendants, as your, me being the plaintiff, they being the defendant, but you're not allowed to list them because they're sovereign. You cannot sue a Native American tribe. And so what the judge said was that everything that did not include anything Native American could go forth, but anything that had to do with Native American issues could not. And this really sucked the life out of my case. And there were still certain things. And so in the end, I did settle with the university, and that settlement resulted in an early retirement. And in part, I decided to do that because I have data and other materials here that I had in my office that, that I was literally told that I could not use for research. And I'm like, there's no reason for me to be at San Jose State University if they're not allowing me to do research. I mean, I like teaching, but that's not why I became a professor. I became a professor to do both research and teaching. And actually, the teaching is a way to subsidize the research, so to speak, right? Because that is how I saw my job. And so, in a way, I just decided that the best option for me would be to take early retirement, and I did a settlement with the university that included maintaining my emeritus status or obtaining emeritus status, which means I still have a university email address, still can have all the university perks like through the library. I'm still technically associated with them, and so forth. And that was very important to me because you cannot publish in academic journals without a university email address. Oftentimes, they won't even accept your paper if it's sent through a .com type of thing. Right. So I don't know in the end how important it will be in the long run, because there's so much censorship now in the journals. The Society for American Archeology, who basically canceled my talk in the spring of 2021, I believe it was, I had a talk at the Society for American Archeology conference. It was on Zoom because of COVID. And basically, the talk was about how NAGPRA violates church and state, and how if we are going to do repatriations, we really need to follow the evidence and not follow creation myths, and that we would not accept creation myths from Christians or Mormons or any Christian denomination, and we should not accept it from Native Americans. And that was the gist of my talk. And it was shown, and then as soon as it was shown, they had pulled it, apologized for showing it, and basically said, we're going to get together a committee to make sure that something like this never happens again. Basically, the talk that everybody wanted to see was the only talk that they decided to pull. Yeah. And now the Society for American Archeology, all of their journals say you cannot show the skeletal remains of Native Americans. Certain artifacts, they will not allow photos to be published. There's somewhere it's like, we may approve stick figures, line drawings.
That's actually something that's been said, is they would approve stick
line drawings, right?
Okay. So you're touching on something that's very important to me. Like I told you before the show started, I work in construction. I'm about as removed from academia as you can be. It seems like your focus is more on the research side, which totally makes sense because that's what you're involved in. But for the public, this NAGPRA law is also devastating. I mean, I learned about this because I called the Ohio History Connection for a totally unrelated reason. But while I had them on the phone, I asked them, I said, hey, I'm trying to learn more about Native Americans. I've been looking for galleries of artifacts online, and I'm just barely finding any images whatsoever. Can you recommend a good repository? And he goes, oh yeah, you're not going to find anything like that due to the federal regulations. We've had to pull all of the images down. So, what I've been going on about on my channel is how this law has effectively erased all Native American history and archaeology from the public view, from the public knowledge. We've talked about them burning x-rays and doing all of these other crazy things. And it would seem that even though NAGPRA is written a certain way, in effect, it is just blanketly erasing everything. Just all information, everything is gone. Books seem to be being pulled from the shelves, images deleted online. Yeah. So as the public, I am no longer allowed to know anything about Native American history, about ancient American history, which is quite upsetting to me.
Yeah, and the thing is, all the digital databases are being like altered so that they have like just like instead of the picture they have just like a little note saying that this image is not available, and it's not, and it's in university databases, it's in museum databases, but it's going beyond now Native Americans. And
Yeah.
even like the Mutta Museum is not showing any human remains on their uh, digital database. And
Wow.
this is like the Mutta Museum. Come on, the museum that used to have the best calendars, of diseases that would come out of it showed whatever disease from their catalog, and it's just amazing. It's a surgical museum, physician museum. How can you
Okay.
erase the human body,
So
from that?
that's a something, else like where does this end? Is there an end? Because I mean, NAGPRA, like I just said, it seems to be the end goal for NAGPRA is the total erasure of all Native American
Right.
history would be. But yeah, is this spreading? I know Canada is very bad off as well, but is this pretty much isolated to America and Canada? Is this spreading across the whole
It
world?
is. It is
Where is this
spreading
going?
across the whole world. It's obviously in Canada. It's obviously in the U.S. It's in Australia and New Zealand. There's issues about like the repatriation of collections throughout Europe now, but giving back like the Benin bronzes and the Elgin marbles and so forth. But then the other thing is that where does it end? I think it ends with the complete ability to study the past through looking at artifacts, fossils, human remains. And the only narratives we're allowed to believe are those told by individuals who belong to groups identified as victims. And that's where the woke comes in. You're like, oh, well, this has nothing to do with woke. It does,
It
because
sure
it's
does.
basically
Yeah.
identity politics gone awry, where instead of, the black white, it's black white and Indian, and the Indian is not, in this case, that's an identity that is being listened to in order to quote unquote right the wrongs of the past,
Yeah.
and that is the woke aspect of it. But the other thing is, it's I don't see how it's going to end in a positive way, because let me give you a couple other examples where I was told that this would never happen, and you know that I always go too far with my predictions. you know um, and I said, at some point, um, you know they're not going to want to show us non-human remains either. And I was in an argument with my colleagues about this. Literally, my departmental colleagues wanted there to be, um, as one of them said, that there should be no photos of human remains unless that human actually signed a permission slip that a photo could be taken. And I said, that's absurd. How far do you go back? Photography has only been around like 350 years,
Right.
if that, Um, and yet now the Smithsonian has that same rule. And when I was last at the Smithsonian, and one of the reasons why I chose to look at museums, how museums were dealing with these kinds of issues, when I spent a year in New York with Heterodox Academy's Center for Academic Pluralism, looking at these issues of, do museums take different approach than universities and from each other? And the answer is that museums, which are more public facing than universities, which is where children's curiosity should be sparked, which is where the amateur archaeologists should be able to go to see something fascinating that they couldn't see just by going online. Those places are even worse than universities, and they're all taking this weird, almost puritanical view of what should be shown and shouldn't be shown. Part of it is, so like the Smithsonian had this Egyptian mummy covered, and it basically said something like, the remains are not to be seen, or but right next to it was a mummy that was on display, an Egyptian. And I contacted the museum and I said, why is the one mummy covered and the other mummy not? I could not figure it out. And then I found an old photo on the Wayback Machine that showed that mummy, and behind it was a photograph of skulls from, I think, the Terry collection, which is one of these forensic anthropology collections. And they decided to cover the mummy to prevent people from seeing the photo of the skulls, because those people have not signed permission slips. And when I was arguing with my colleague, I thought she was the absurd one. And I said, what's the difference between showing the remains of, let's say, a deer or a lion, or, and she's like, oh, there's a world of difference because those are not people. And I said, but if you're not religious, there really is no difference. If you don't believe in the spiritual connection of humans to, made in God's image and all this stuff, then really there should be no difference between displaying a lion's skull versus a human skull. Right. It's very different if you see something, like if I now come across an animal that has just been killed or has just died and feeling sadness for that death, you're not feeling sadness because of the remains. You're feeling sadness because of that life has ended. Right. And so that's very different, like a funeral. That's a very different sense. It's about the passage of life to death. And what has ended up happening is that instead of people saying, wow, that's a good point, and, we should start showing remains, they've gone the other way around. They've gone the other way around. And the latest things that are being talked about in NAGPRA committees are, we should be able to repatriate animals imbued with human spirits. And so I think it's going to end up swallowing up all the natural history collections. And at some point, you're going to go into the American Museum of Natural History, and the animal collections won't be on display either. That's where I think it's going. And this is a tragedy.
I agree completely. That's where I see it going too. But again, I'm an outsider. I am very removed from academia, but that is the impression that I got as well. I don't know if you've ever heard of Illegitimate Scholar. He's also on YouTube. He's done one video talking about NAGPRA as well. He's an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, and he spent most of the time making the point that anything and everything can be classified as sacred with the way that, things. But if you're looking for more people to talk to, he, I'm sure, would be glad to talk to you about this. And earlier I said that I am a very conspiratorial person, and I didn't see what happened to you necessarily as particularly conspiratorial. But when we are talking about how this isn't just erasing American history, you see this spreading across the world, and I do as well. I see it going, it's not slowing down, right? I see it only accelerating. And so when I look at that, and I look at everything else that I see wrong with archaeology as well, I do think that there is a conspiracy to cover up history. And not so much that people are sitting down with individual archaeologists and coercing them to do this, but, they do see that these woke mechanisms are in play and that they are effective. And so I think they encourage them because they know the result of that will be history is erased, and control the past, control the future kind of deal. I'm coming from this. I do see, like you said in the very beginning of the episode, everything happens to be going in one way. Like when we're looking at NAGPRA, it's always more towards censorship, more towards repatriation. And that is across the board what I'm witnessing. And so it does become a little bit difficult for me to go, well, this is all just a coincidence. It does seem like there is an effort to hide history from people like me.
Yeah, I do think that part of that effort to hide history is because they don't want us to see the negative aspects of prehistory, of people, especially prehistory that was not very pretty but also not European, right? So, Native Americans had a long history of slavery before the Europeans got into the American continent. We know that in part because when the Europeans started engaging in the slave trade in the New World, they even used the same sites that some of the Native Americans in Florida used, for example. Okay. We also have good ethnographic evidence that the Northwest coast was full of slavery, tribes which changed the shape of their head, and then if another tribe didn't have that, they would not even consider them human. Potlatches were banned in part because chiefs were killing slaves, and the Christians were like, you cannot do this. You cannot just kill somebody to show your wealth. And, I'm an atheist. I'm not saying that they had everything right, but that was one of the reasons why they banned potlatches, the missionaries.
I don't know what a potlatch is, by the way.
Okay. So basically a potlatch is when the two tribal chiefs would come together and they would bring their riches and they would try to so
they were killing slaves just as a display.
Yes. And they would bring each other gifts, and so it would be like, look how rich I am. Here are 100 women, Right. And then the other one will be, well, no, I'm much richer. I can kill these 200 slaves and give you 100 women, So it was this kind of one-upmanship that in some ways did help keep the peace. It's like an arms race, right? But it did so at the expense in a brutal way. So that's what, and we had this occurring for quite a long time. Actually, slavery in Indian country ended after slavery of the colonialists. People don't like to talk about this. That's one of the reasons why they want to hide the past, is because they want to draw this story that they were the first environmentalists, they were always peaceful, they were egalitarian, and this is just not true. Yeah, they replaced other tribes. And the thing is, in my view, all people had bad pasts. This is not unique to Native American or indigenous peoples of the Americas. I'm not passing judgment on it in that way. I think it's actually kind of a testament to humans that we have progressed as much as we have, and I hope we progress further. But I'm not saying, oh well, those people did this, and you're
taking issue with the fact that people are saying you're not allowed to talk about that.
Right.
That people are trying to cover up what actually happened. It's not that. Yeah, I fully understand.
Like this sample that I looked at, the Carthage sample, for example, it fell between the time after the German Vandals came and destroyed the city of Carthage, and then they rebuilt it. So, my mother's German. We have plenty of baggage. I don't want to cover it up. It's not, that's just German history and prehistory. That's just, but then and before the Muslim invasion. So this is normal things that happened in the past, and yet the indigenous people around the world don't want it to be known that they did these things too. Um, I think the other reason why they want to cover up the past is because many new archaeologists, they did not go into the field for the reasons why you would want to go into a field or why I studied anthropology. They go in it to view the past through their lens or their identity. And so you get absurdities like the queer archaeology interest group, whose basic job is to go through the archaeological record and try to find queerness. And that's it. And why? And if you look at who's studying this, they are individuals who identify as queer. And so they
Obviously,
want to, the two-spirit term is a new term. It just came out in 1990 at a gay, lesbian, bisexual fair in Winnipeg. These are new inventions.
And you
Because
had a talk canceled, I believe, and the reason because you were presenting on the binary of sex and skeletons, and I believe a direct quote was that sex is not binary, the science is settled.
yes,
Yeah, which is just insane. And I mean, all of this is, again, I'm not an academic. I don't trust archaeologists. I have lost faith and trust in archaeologists. I spend a lot of the time on this channel criticizing archaeologists for being dishonest and having double standards in things like that, where it's so blatant. I mean, it is 2 + 2 = 5.
right.
It's really, I think that even average people who aren't that interested in archaeology, I got my haircut today, and I was talking about the interview I was going to be doing with you. And when I told the ladies about, they were incensed. They're like, that's so ridiculous that they would try and say that sex is not binary, and that they would shut down a conversation about that.
Yeah.
So I mean,
That
yeah,
was
I think
actually,
it's just so
that
blatant.
was
It really damages people's trust.
That was actually my most recent cancellation. I was going to be on a panel about the binary nature of sex and how that's important for anthropologists. And I was going to talk about how it's important for archaeology and forensics, and so all the physical anthropology type aspects. And like one of the things is that, when you're trying to reconstruct the past, one of the first things you do is you sex and age the individuals, because that's a huge important part, even in our modern lives. Whether you're male or female and what your age you are determines a lot of what you go through. So, and the whole panel was canceled, and it was like, and I actually thought that was being very moderate, because I said the title of my talk was "Make No Bones About It: Sex, Skeletal Sex is Binary. People may not be." And so the last
Very
part of
open.
my the last part of my talk was centered around forensic anthropology, and I was saying, forensic anthropologists definitely still need to know biological sex is binary. They need to be able to identify a homicide victim by male or female, but they also may want to look at for clues in these forensic cases of whether a person lived a different way. Like, for example, did they have feminization surgery, which changes their skull, their brows. Like if you're a male who wants to be a woman, you get your
Shave
bone
down the
shaved
jawline
here,
kind
and
of thing. Yeah.
can this help forensic anthropologists? Turns out it really can't, at least so far that we know, because it's really hard to erase evidence that your sex is your sex.
That was a fascinating thing to hear, was that even after the feminization surgery, it was 90+% that they were,
still
getting
identified in the male category. And so I actually think that this is not transphobic. How can this be transphobic to want to help people who've identify. I
It's
want to
just
help
factual.
homicide.
It's not even delving into the realm of transphobia. From what I could tell, you weren't trying to put any position on it whatsoever. You were dealing exclusively with the factual elements.
Yeah.
And then they come back and they say it's settled science that sex is not binary. So just
not binary, yeah. And so in a sense, this is once again that wokeness of the identity politics of the victim, the trans, versus the victimizers, the non-trans, the TERFs, right? But yeah, and I think that throughout my life, whenever I love talking about anthropology and archaeology. I love talking about my research because I love that field. I think, it's one of these fields that I think that no matter who you're talking to and you tell them, people say, well, what do you do? And I'm a biological anthropologist. I study the skeletal remains of past people. Their eyes light up. They're like, oh my goodness, that's so interesting. Tell me more. And I know that it's about the field because I have a sister. She's 1 year older than me. And she's gorgeous. Yeah, she's like, she's truly gorgeous. She's like, they wanted her, she won like some beauty contest when she was 17, and so like whenever we'd go out, guys would start talking to us, like if we're out at night, and she's now a college dean, but at the time she was a English lit professor, and so like, oh, what do you do? And she'd be like, English lit, and they'd be like, oh, not interested anymore. Yeah. And it's a cut, and then I'd be like anthropology, and they'd be like, yes. So I do think it is a field that even if you're not an academic, it has so much to offer people on an interest level that is intellectual but doesn't need to be academic, and that's what a beautiful aspect of it. And when I wrote my book on the warpath, I aimed it so that someone who's never read an anthropology book can go right into that and read it and enjoy it and understand the concept. So I hope it's not jargon ridden. I really tried to make it very readable. And
I started to read it, and I was enjoying it. So
good.
But I also am someone who's very interested in this type of stuff, so I would be your target audience, not your average person. But yeah. So if you don't mind, I've got a bunch of questions that I would like to ask. And one of them is, I've got a nephew who's got a friend who wants to go into archaeology. And so with everything that we've been talking about, I declared archaeology dead. I think you nodded your head in agreement. Do you have any advice for people who are looking to get into archaeology or anthropology today? What words of warning, what would you say to them?
I would say that, in some ways, I think that anthropology and archaeology are very problematic nowadays. California, I just published an article on how you cannot find a collection to study in all of California's public universities. Some universities have even put a ban on the use of photographs and data slides for classes. So I would say if he's not in California, that's better. Okay. I think that there's still some archaeology to be done in the old world in Europe, especially if he's not looking at indigenous populations. I do think that who knows how long that's going to last, but I don't want to say don't study archaeology because it is such a fascinating field, and maybe it will bounce back. I really think like the study of skeletal remains in the US is probably done. It's probably dead and buried, unfortunately. But I'm still hoping that I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong. And I'm still hoping that other places around the world can save anthropology and archaeology. And so I would say to him, know what you're getting into, but don't necessarily decide not to go into it.
So, somewhat related, we're talking about where this all ends up, right? And neither of us have a very good prognostication, but I do believe that if people knew what was happening, they would care. They wouldn't, you know. I think that the vast majority of people have no idea what NAGPRA is doing. They have no idea that research is being stopped and discouraged, and that information is being removed from the public. I think people would care about that if they knew. In the same way that Twitter mob, motivated all of your colleagues to come after you, I think it could motivate them also to change their minds on, things like NAGPRA and repatriation. But I have zero hope for it changing internally. But I do think that external forces could potentially save it. So if enough awareness is garnered, that could potentially do it. Also, Donald Trump was just elected. Have you considered contacting anyone in his campaign about maybe installing a new secretary in the Department of Interior and having them work on this from that side?
Yeah, I have considered that, and I've considered that, and also considered different ways, different angles that might be legal angles. As I said, it's very hard to get the legal issue because you cannot sue tribes, right? But I'm definitely still writing, definitely still reaching out to people, definitely still taking an active role in that. And that was another reason why I wanted to stay emeritus professor, because that means that I still have a stake in this story, because I still plan to do research. It's very hard to move anything forward if you are, basically saying, I'm not, it has nothing to do with me anymore. I consistently try to reach out to people who disagree with me, or who are on the fence, both in official circles but also outside. I kind of feel like there are three audiences that you always have to remember, whether it's going to government bureaucrats or politicians or the everyday reader. You always have three audiences. You have the audience who doesn't know, and so you're informing them, right? You have the audience who's against you, who you're trying to convince to come over to your side, and you have the people who are already on your side. And those people, you still have to write for them and speak up for them, because they need to maintain some hope. Sometimes you got to sing to the choir. Yeah. So I think that's, I kind of see it that way. You could also say that in that first audience, the group that doesn't know, there are those people who are on the fence, that you're trying to convince. So I do, after my year in New York, I wrote an article for the New York Post about identity politics in museums and how museums have gone awry. I tried to hit some of the big newspapers. It's very hard to get something into the New York Times or any of the more liberal ones, which that is my goal, because in some ways they're the ones I need to convince.
Right. Yeah. I mean, awareness is the first step, I think, was the tweet I put out, right? And yes. Like I said, I've been trying to spread this news for almost half a year. I've got a very, very small channel, but I've been struggling. People, even after they learn about it, there is a lot of why should I care, or disbelief that it's happening, because this is a pretty crazy law.
That's one of the. Sorry, that's one of the things that people sometimes say to me is really?
Yeah.
With the museums. When I first got to New York, I was looking at the Northwest Hall, which is the big Northwest Hall in the American Museum of Natural History about the Northwest Coast Indians. And I couldn't believe the fairy tales that they were putting up as true histories, like, oh, Chief so and so in 1865 met a thunderbird and, you know, talking whale and so forth. Not like this is our belief and this is our, but they
But
actually
this
said
is what actually
this is
happened.
a historic day. This is a historic event. And
Right.
then the other thing was the case with the medicine masks that basically have like a warning sign of no photos. These masks are really powerful. You may not even want to look at them. I mean, what is up with that? I mean, that's kind of like a crazy thing in and of itself. So I think that that's another aspect of it.
I do
Um,
think those have existed on some Egyptian exhibits as well about curses
yeah,
and stuff. So yeah, it's not unique to Native
no,
Americans, which
no,
makes it even worse because yeah,
right.
this stuff can affect
And
anything.
you know, the thing is, one of the ways to get people interested and concerned about this is to show that repatriation ideology, which has in NAGPRA, which has gutted anthropology in the museums and collections, has is oozing into other fields with the Biden administration's indigenous mandate that was passed in January, where they're basically saying that you have to take into account indigenous knowledge to get grants for all sorts of things, like the CDC, and redefining prayer, Native American prayer, as important aspect of healthcare. I mean, this is so. If from this came from anthropology. It is
Oh
an
my goodness.
outgrowth of anthropology. And so I think that this is, you know, people are like, well, we're not so worried about some, you know, stone tools over there. But if you then going to your doctor and he's like, well, you know what, a cheap option is for us to burn some sage and say some prayers over you. And I'm told that this is good health care, you better be concerned then, right?
And that is so utterly ridiculous. I know what you're saying is true because I've looked into this a lot and I trust your word, but you say that to someone on the street and they're going to look at you like you're crazy.
Yeah,
What are you talking about? That's utter nonsense. So it's, I mean, they've made a law, and it's not just the law, it's the whole extreme culture of archaeology. And like you're saying, this is spilling over into other areas now, but like it's so extreme that even trying to inform people of it is a challenge because it's just so utterly ridiculous. Um, you mentioned a while ago that before you wrote your second book, that you were entertaining ideas for other books, and one of the ideas was essentially, I think, the same thing, but involving other people. So bringing other people's stories of dealing with similar things into it. Uh, are there other people like you? Are you completely alone in your fight? I know that you get quiet support. I know you get silent
yeah.
support, but like, is there anyone else who's actually fighting against this stuff openly?
I know that there are a handful of archaeologists, anthropologists who have written about it, or who have supported me on it. Very few and far between. And believe it or not, they're almost all older than me. So many of them are already retired. Tim White just retired. Tim White is UC Berkeley. He was very critical of the repatriation ideology and NAGPRA. Jeffrey Clark is a paleoanthropologist, so deals with fossils. He wrote an article quite a while back called NAGPRA and the Demon Haunted World, taking that term from Carl Sagan. And but I think if he might be retiring, but he's also, you know, in a sense, he deals with more fossils than skeletal remains. Like a handful of people I could think of, but most of the time it's like, you know, the support comes quietly. I was incredibly grateful to those who wrote affidavits on my behalf in my lawsuit. Those included Della Cook from University of Indiana, and she's retired or retiring. Douglas Owsley from the who's at the Smithsonian, and Bruce Baruch, who's Bates College, but he's retired, and Marshall Joseph Becker, who's the archaeologist who retired.
Yeah, there's a pattern. It's the only people willing to speak out are the ones who are already out of the game, because this is a suicide.
And I think that, in all fairness, I think part of it is the new generation is not this. They didn't come into anthropology for the same reasons. As we said, they came into anthropology not because they want to understand other people, but because they basically are looking at ways to justify their own lifestyle. And therefore you get the queer archaeology interest group, the Trans Doe Task Force, and so forth, the Black Trowel movement. And I think that's they're in the field for the wrong reasons. The reason to study anthropology, archaeology specifically, is to understand the past, not to understand yourself. You go to a therapist for that, not to archaeology.
Well said. So obviously this would be an anecdotal answer, but like, from your experience, what is the feel? What is the breakdown? Is it a silent majority? Is it a silent minority?
I think it's a silent minority. I would say maybe about 10%, if we're lucky.
Oh God, that's dismal.
So, yeah.
Oh no.
And the other thing is that even
that's really bad.
Recently, when I did the research on what's available in California collections, most people just didn't respond to me. Most people just didn't respond to me at all.
And these are people who are in the field.
Yes, yeah. And whose job it is to respond. So I contacted the NAGPRA coordinators, the tribal liaisons, the archaeologists in the department, and so forth. So it's a job to respond, and they still didn't. And say, well, maybe they didn't respond to me because I'm Elizabeth Weiss, Right. They know my reputation. But the article actually was very neutral, in the sense that I was literally asking them, what are the regulations now to get access to skeletal remains? What collections are available? And I said, I'm not looking for access. I'm just looking for the protocols and the information to be able to understand where anthropology is in California right now. Not, what is archaeology and anthropology like in California right now? The answer is, I could not find a single collection.
That is something that I have dealt with. It's very difficult to even get definitive, clear answers on a lot of this stuff, because you have how the law is written, and you have how people are using and abusing it, and then you have the narrative that's being put forward, and all of these things are all contradictory to each other. But if you don't mind, I've got some actual archaeology questions that I was interested in. So you talked about the Kennewick Man a little while ago, and I believe that the word Caucasian was used in the DNA test, and I believe that they retracted that. Can you shed any light on that? Was there Caucasian DNA, or wasn't there, or was it not determined, or
Right. So basically what it looked like is that, initially they did the metrics, and the metrics looked like, depending on who you ask, Caucasian. Some people said the Ainu, so pre-Mongolian Japanese. Right. Some people said Native American. And craniometrics is a really great way to draw, and craniometric studies of the skull, measurements of the skull, is a really great way to draw family trees, but it becomes harder if you just have one. individual, right? So
Okay.
Kennewick Man. But when you look at all of the Paleo Indians, and there's been like 24 maybe, and you look at their craniometrics, what you find is that they don't always look like modern Native American tribes. So in other words, Native Americans that started after 5,000 years even, they don't look like each other, which suggests
Okay.
multiple migrations.
Okay.
And so Kennewick Man's initial DNA results were unsuccessful. The second set showed that he had some similarities with some Caucasian groups, some similarities with some Native American, the Colville, and the most similar to South American indigenous populations. So remains from South America, and so basically, which suggests that he was not related very closely to the North Americans. And I believe that there's two other aspects to this. One thing is that unless you have a huge database of DNA from the Native Americans, then you can't really tell who he's closer to, right? You can,
Right.
and that's one of the important aspects of NAGPRA. It's not a pan Indian law. It's a law that says which tribe is it closest to, which is
And
it
only
most
the
affiliated
federally
with,
recognized tribes.
right, of the
Yeah.
federally recognized tribes. So basically, they couldn't make that determination because they didn't have the data. But from what data they had, compared to all of the North American samples, Kennewick Man was still closer related to the South American samples, and about even with Caucasian to some of the Native Americans. So he's not Native American in what we would think of as tied to our North American Native American tribes. And
Right.
yet he was reburied because they said, oh, there's a connection between the Colville and Kennewick Man. Now, interestingly, he wasn't reburied using NAGPRA. Obama passed a congressional act to rebury Kennewick Man. A
That
congressional
is
order.
pretty ridiculous. So he specifically for Kennewick Man, Obama passed some.
A
Wow.
congressional order to bury him. Yeah.
So you partially answered, my next question, which is, I believe from listening to your other interviews, you seem favorable on the idea of early diffusion, like pre-Ice Age diffusion, and it seemed like you just suggested that multiple different populations were here during the time of the Kennewick Man. So yeah, one of my viewers really wants to know about the Solutrean hypothesis and your opinion on the Solutrean hypothesis. So I'll go ahead and ask that. Do you have any thoughts on the Solutrean hypothesis?
I am very much on the fence of the Solutrean hypothesis and when the actual peopling of the Americas occurred. I do think that there were some early migrations over. I don't know how old. The oldest Native American that's been discovered has been, I think, 14,000 years old. So maybe there was, a passing, either right after the Ice Age, during the Ice Age, in a different direction. I'm actually completely open to when it happened. Maybe I'm wrong, and it's 30,000. So I'm actually completely on the fence of it. And I know that, there's been like the very old footprints in New Mexico. I think 27,000. But
Yeah.
there's been a lot of debate about the dating of that because the type of dating that is used sometimes makes the dates much older. It's, my view, and like the Solutrean hypothesis, basically that very early, some of the early artifacts look like European from the artifacts from France, is there's a couple possibilities. One is that these things are similar just coincidentally. For example, there are pyramids all over the world. That's a possibility, right? Yeah. Another thing is that it could have come from Europe, very strong possibility of that too. Another thing is that it could be that there's a third answer that we don't even know. For example, maybe the Solutreans got it from some other group. But in my opinion, until I see a 30,000-year-old skeletal remain in human remains in the Americas, I'm keeping an open mind. And I just, which I would love to see. I would love to see that. But I am very sure that there wasn't just one crossing. I am, because of what I said about the Paleo-Indians looking different, I'm very comfortable saying that there were multiple crossings from multiple places, like from like the Kelp Highway, the Bering Strait, the Kelp Highway, maybe an Atlantic crossing, and that the date is yet to be known, and as is the Solutrean hypothesis. It's still up in the air for me, at least. Yeah.
I love that answer. Fantastic answer. So maybe a slightly more controversial, more difficult question, because that's all talking pretty far in the past. I personally believe in more modern diffusion as well. Do you have any thoughts on more recent diffusion, like specifically the last few thousand years, 2,000-3,000 years? And as a second part of this question, because you obviously don't adhere to this, you just said you're very open-minded, but there is an extremely strict non-diffusionist adherence in American archaeology. It seems to be a very forbidden topic to touch on. And between NAGPRA and the extreme culture of archaeology and everything else, if something were to be found, say remains of a European or something else within the last couple thousand years, or if DNA evidence, like, do you think it's unreasonable that something like that might be covered up, that it might disappear, with how strongly there is that adherence to?
Right.
Like, yeah.
So I think that we've seen that Europeans, the Vikings, for example, got to the Americas much earlier than we expected. We also know that there's definitely a lot of turnover in tribes. That it wasn't all peaceful, right? There's a lot of replacement. I don't see that there'd be likely just one migration into the Americas, even later on, So I do think that this is likely kind of a continuous peopling of the Americas. One of the things is because America is so vast, that a lot of times people didn't come into contact with each other. And so I think that made people think, oh, this land is empty, just like when Europeans came here, right, and manifest destiny. And so I do think that it's quite possible that there's multiple populations from multiple different places that came into the Americas in multiple different times, even more recently. If there's a European remain that's found that's like 3,000 to 4,000 years old, would they cover it up? I would say that they would probably just say, you know what, this is Native American. Our creation myth said that we started off with red hair and blue eyes and big noses, and then we got more attractive. I really think that they would just say that these are Native Americans, just like they did with Kennewick Man. I mean, we don't. There are some Paleo-Indians that were not even studied. We don't even know what happened to them. We don't know where they're from. We don't know,
And they were reburied already?
They're already reburied. There's like, I would say most of the Paleo-Indians have been reburied. I'm trying to think of which ones haven't, maybe one or two, but
I think you talk about that in the beginning of one of your books. You list the
Repatriation and Erasing the Past. I have a table even which ones are. Some of them, were not studied at all. So we don't know really.
Wow.
Is this a cover-up? I would say absolutely. They don't want to know that this might not be related to modern tribes. That's
Right.
one of the big, I mean, one of the big things that Native Americans have been saying is, respect our creation myths, and they don't say it that way. It's to respect our oral histories, our oral traditions. And what they mean by that is don't challenge them. That's what they mean when they say respect. They mean say, don't challenge them. If you find something that looks like unexpected, that's not unexpected. We know about it. It should be buried. I mean, when they found Kennewick Man, one of the first things that the Department of Interior did was they buried the site with like 2,000 pounds of gravel so that nothing more would be discovered. This is not, it sounds like a conspiracy.
It sure does to me. As someone who believes in conspiracy, it definitely does.
So, why would they do that? What were they worried about?
Yeah.
That somebody would find an artifact that would challenge our current understanding? I do think that there would be cover up, and maybe already has been.
I just very quickly, you might look into the Bat Creek stone. It's as an artifact that's been covered up. I think it's maybe one of the most prime examples in American archaeology. But I don't want to take up all your time. I know you've given me so much already. I do have a couple more questions, if it's okay. So I'm going to send them both to you. The pre-Columbian population collapse, I don't know if you have any insights into that. It would seem that the Native American population collapsed within the 100 or 200 years or so before Columbus came. So if you have any thoughts on that. And then, we've talked about the Native Americans being a Stone Age people, but 7,000 years ago around the Great Lakes area, they were smelting copper. 2,000 years ago, the Hopewell were squaring the circle with some of their earthworks, or at least allegedly, right? So it seems that there was a decently high achievement rate, advancement rate in the distant past, and then they returned to a more Stone Age civilization. So could that be related to these potential other populations, or what reasons do you see for that?
Right. Well, okay, so let me talk about the population collapse. I think that one of the things is we're not 100% sure how many people there were, so that makes it a little difficult. But there was definitely a collapse before the Europeans arrived. What the magnitude is, it's hard to say, but there was. Some of this may relate to climate change, like droughts and so forth. We have evidence in the Southwest and the Four Corners of populations collapsing due to like medieval climate anomaly, and then leading to increased warfare because the good lands are more scarce with this bad climate, mainly droughts, but also then you get the examples of the cannibalism occurring during that time. And so we do have these kinds of around before the Europeans arrive, climate had and sometimes caused populations to collapse, civilizations to collapse. And so that's definitely part of it. But then we also have, when we get agriculture, we see a dip in the population because they start moving in closer together. Their diet is not quite as good. They get more susceptible to passing diseases because they're closer together. Their water is not as good because they're close together. And we see a dip in population as well at that point. And then they kind of recover. And it's quite interesting like people are like, why would you adopt agriculture? It seems to always lead to bad things. Because even though there's like this dip in human health and populations at the beginning of
Easier.
agriculture, it basically in the long run it's easier and it's more stable, right?
Laziness is yeah.
Yes. So so there are those two very clear examples with the medieval climate anomaly and with agriculture. And then there were probably other things like certain diseases coming about, and
And I
and
wonder,
populations coming in and replacing others as well. That's another thing.
right,
So I do think that those things happened, and we
is
do know that population fluctuated.
is someone who does believe in diffusion and stuff. It even occurred to me that it's not so far removed from the time of the Black Plague, and
Right.
while this certainly is not the mainstream idea, it could have been even that the Black Plague started in America and was taken to China. Just timeline. It was something that an idea that had occurred to me. I don't know.
Yeah, and the other thing is like plague, syphilis, tuberculosis. Those There's good evidence that some of those diseases have been found early on in both the New and Old World.
They
Um,
were already here.
and I mean, we're pretty sure that syphilis was brought back to Europe from Columbus. We're pretty sure about that. But like
Right.
tuberculosis, which was used to be thought of as we brought it to the New World, now we're pretty sure that it was not brought to the New World from us, but that it was already in the population. So that's another example. So,
That's a new fact to me. Yeah, interesting.
and so I do think that those things have an effect. So what was the
My
second part?
second question was that there seems to be a level of advancement achieved in the very
Oh,
distant
yes.
past that is lost, and I was just wondering if you had thoughts on.
Yeah, I think that there's several possibilities there as well. One of it is that it could be different peoples, that they could have been replaced. One
And that's
we
not
do see that.
because you work with the bones. So the
Yeah.
idea that those people could have been here and been replaced, and we haven't found them yet, that's not a crazy idea to you as someone who works with the
It's
bones.
not it's not a crazy idea, and for a couple reasons. One is I don't know what percentage of people who've died have been found, but it's a minuscule percentage. And the smaller the original population, the less likely it is to have been found. I don't
Right.
think Kennewick Man was the only one of the Paleo Indians, strolling around Washington State, and yet
Obviously,
he's the
yeah.
only one found, right? So I do think you have to take that into consideration. That
Okay.
we find a very small percentage of people who died. The other thing is, has anyone tested it? So with Orion Mound, for example, the collection at San Jose State, it spans like 2,500 years. And when I got to San Jose, I was told it's one single population. This is a single continuous population. And actually, they're even related to the later populations, the Moek-Ohlone in the Bay Area. And so this long continuous population. And I had believed it. And I had even said, I think this is a good reason why the Bay Area tribes should get federal recognition. I really thought that it was that was the case. And then a researcher came to San Jose, and this was fairly like mid-career or so. I can't remember exactly, but he's like looking at the skeletal remains for research as a comparison sample for others, and he's like, there seems to be two different peoples here. And I was like, oh, really? Like, yeah, I like a more delicately built one and then a more robust one. I was like, I never thought about that. I was told it was one population, in part because the artifacts don't change. And so I thought, okay, I'll take a look at that. And so then the first time I did it, I didn't find any differences and it was just kind of like a pilot study, so I didn't look at the whole sample. But then I thought, it was inconclusive, so I decided to do 2 more studies on it. And I did one, then I combined those 2 studies to make it a stronger article. And I found that sample, the Ryan Mound, actually might have been 3 populations. The earliest were replaced by a later one, who might have been replaced by another one. Yeah. But it was definitely not one. And this collection had been around since like the early 1960s, and everybody had thought it was just one until it was tested. So, you could have like this collection up there and people say, oh, well, it's one population, and it might be more than one. And that might help explain why there's a shift in culture. And there's other possibilities, but I don't see why that shouldn't be one of the possible things to investigate. Because, the beautiful thing about it is, if you have the bones, you can investigate it. Then the artifacts and the bones are completely independent, so you're not relying on just one source of information. So it is a testable hypothesis, but they won't let you test it.
It does seem to be from someone who's outside of academia, it does seem to be the radioactive, though. Like, if I were an archaeologist, I would be very afraid to run those tests if I suspected that I might get those types of results. I think that'd be very dangerous for my career.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Weiss, I have absolutely loved this entire conversation. I would love to continue talking to you for many more hours, but I have held you for a very long time. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I don't know if there's anything that you would like to say. Your books are in the description. I encourage people to check them out. Is any closing statement?
I just want to, I'll close with saying that even with all the problems that we see in archaeology and anthropology, it's such a fascinating field. It's a field that's so close to my heart and so many people's hearts and passions that we cannot give up on it, even if we don't think that there's much hope. I think that, I will go on and on and on talking about it and fighting for it, even if I have to do it until there's not a single bone left in the museums. But this is the first field that is really being erased by woke culture, and we need to fight back, and we need to continue to talk about it and tell others about it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that is the episode, fellas, and I am going to go ahead and do an after stream for everyone. So no Patreon, feel free to join in and we can discuss everything that we just heard from Dr. Weiss. So thank you so much, and later, fellas.
Okay, bye-bye.